Millionaire sees his 5-year-old twins begging in the street, a sight he thought only happened in nightmares. He drops everything to pull them from the pavement, but then they whisper 2 words that stop his heart. Those 2 simple words will uncover a secret so painful, it could destroy the family he spent his life building. What he does next will define not just his fortune, but the meaning of fatherhood itself. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Luca Varelli's polished leather shoes clicked against the wet cobblestones as he stepped out of his black Mercedes. The morning drizzle left a fine mist on his tailored suit, but he barely noticed. His mind was already running through the day's schedule at Hotel Fiorenza, the crown jewel of his family's hospitality empire. Every minute was accounted for, every meeting precisely timed, just the way he preferred it. Mr. Varelli, you have the board meeting at 9, followed by the inspection of the new suites at 10:30, lunch with the Milanese investors at noon, and... His assistant Marco hurried alongside him, tablet in hand, rattling off appointments with practiced efficiency. But something made Luca pause mid-stride. Across the street, huddled under the faded striped awning of Cafe Romano, stood 2 small figures, twin girls, no more than 7 years old, clutching bunches of wilted daisies. Their matching brown coats were worn thin at the elbows and their shoes were caked with mud. Despite the morning chill that had most passers-by bundled in scarves, neither wore gloves or proper winter attire. "Mr. Varelli, is everything all right?" Marco's voice faded into background noise, becoming nothing more than a distant hum. Luca couldn't look away from the girls. One of them, the slightly taller one, held out flowers hopefully to passing tourists who hurried by without a glance, some even stepping around her as if she were merely an obstacle. Her sister stayed close, watching the crowds with wary eyes that seemed too old for her young face. There was something about them that tugged at a carefully buried part of him, a corner of his heart he'd locked away years ago. "Cancel the 9 o'clock, Luca said abruptly, his voice cutting through Marco's continued recitation. Without waiting for Marco's response or acknowledging his look of surprise, he strode across the rain-slicked street, dodging a scooter that whizzed by too close. The taller girl noticed him first. Her eyes widened as he approached, but she didn't shrink back like most street vendors did when they saw him coming. Instead, she lifted her chin with unexpected dignity and held out her modest bouquet, a businesswoman in miniature. "Flowers, signore?" Her voice was clear and steady with a hint of determination. "Only €2. They're fresh, mostly." Up close, Luca could see that her coat was actually a deep burgundy, though years of wear had faded it almost brown. A small paint stain marked one sleeve, bright blue against the dull fabric. Her sister's coat was identical, down to the missing bottom button that had been replaced with a safety pin that glinted in the weak morning light. "How many do you have?" Luca asked quietly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. The girl blinked, clearly thrown by the unusual question. 23 daisies, signore." She paused, then added with careful honesty that touched something inside him. "Some are a little droopy, but they still smell nice." "I'll take them all." Luca reached for his wallet, the expensive leather a stark contrast to the girl's worn appearance. "And your sister's as well." The quiet twin, who had been studying him intently from behind her sister, missing nothing with those observant eyes, clutched her flowers tighter to her chest. But the first girl beamed, revealing a missing front tooth that somehow made her look even more vulnerable. "That's 46 daisies total," she announced proudly, her mental arithmetic immediate. "Nella counted twice this morning. She's good with numbers." Luca pulled out a €50 note, crisp and new. The girl's eyes grew round at the sight of it, a sum that probably represented more than days of flower selling. "Keep the change," he said, accepting both modest bouquets with more care than he'd shown the rare orchids delivered weekly to his penthouse. They were indeed wilted, probably picked yesterday from some public garden or roadside, but he found himself handling them gently all the same, as if they were precious. The taller girl, Mira, he heard her sister whisper urgently, took a step closer. Her gaze was intense, almost searching as she looked up at his face, studying his features with unsettling focus. There was an intelligence in those eyes that disturbed him, like she was solving a puzzle he couldn't see, connecting dots invisible to everyone else. Nella tugged at her sister's sleeve, caution evident in her every movement, but Mira stood her ground, fearless and determined. For a moment, no one moved. The busy Florentine morning flowed around them like a river around three stones. Then Luca gave them a short nod and turned to leave, unsure why his throat felt suddenly tight. He felt a small hand brush against his coat, so quick he might have imagined it, a feather-light touch gone in an instant. But by the time he looked back, both girls were hurrying away, their muddy shoes leaving tiny prints on the wet sidewalk that would soon be washed away by the persistent drizzle. Marco was waiting anxiously by the hotel entrance, his expression caught between concern and confusion. "Sir, about the board meeting. The investors are already gathering and—" "Handle it," Luca cut him off, striding through the ornate lobby with purpose. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness by staff who arrived before dawn. Hotel employees nodded respectfully as he passed, but he barely noticed, his mind occupied with small hands and searching eyes. His private office was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, with a view of Florence's terracotta rooftops spreading out like a russet sea. Luca set the daisies carefully on his desk, then shrugged off his coat, hanging it with his usual precision. Something fluttered to the floor. A folded piece of paper, torn from a child's notebook, its edges slightly ragged. He picked it up slowly, noting the careful creases, the deliberate folding. The handwriting inside was large and wobbly, but clearly done with great concentration, each letter formed with determined care. 3 words that stopped his breath in his chest and made the world tilt beneath his feet. "Are you our daddy?" Luca stared at the note, his usually steady hands gone still. The morning sounds of the hotel faded away, the distant chatter of guests, the soft classical music in the lobby, the efficient movements of staff. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and a roaring in his ears like distant waves crashing against a shore he'd never visited. With mechanical precision, his body moving on autopilot while his mind raced, he crossed to the door. The lock clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of his office, sealing him away with a question that threatened to unravel his meticulously ordered world. The evening shadows lengthened across Florence as Hotel Fiorenza gradually emptied. Tourists returned to their rooms, staff members clocked out, and the usual bustle of the grand lobby faded to silence. But in his top-floor office, Luca Varelli remained, his tie loosened, jacket draped over a chair. The note from this morning lay on his desk, its childish scrawl seeming to mock him. He'd spent the entire day in a fog, going through the motions of meetings and management decisions while his mind kept circling back to those twin girls. Their worn coats, their careful counting of daisies, the way the taller one had studied his face. The hotel's computer hummed softly as Luca logged into the secure staff archive. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. In 7 years, he'd never searched for her name, had forced himself not to think about those few precious weeks, but now, he typed slowly, ELARA. The cursor blinked at him. What was he expecting to find? It had been one perfect summer, stolen moments between his management duties and her cleaning shifts, quiet conversations in empty hallways, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, how she'd known exactly how to break through his carefully constructed walls. Then she'd vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. He'd told himself it was better that way. Clean, professional. The heir to Hotel Fiorenza couldn't get involved with a maid. He'd buried himself in work and pretended the ache in his chest wasn't real. The search results appeared. Ilara Castelli, housekeeping staff 2016 to 2017. His throat tightened as her employee photo filled the screen, dark curls pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the hotel's navy uniform. But it was her eyes that caught him, warm brown, with tiny gold flecks that the camera had somehow managed to capture. The same eyes he'd seen this morning, studying him from 2 small faces. Luca's hands weren't quite steady as he opened her personnel file. Everything was meticulously documented, as he'd expect from his HR department. outstanding performance reviews, perfect attendance, guest compliments about her thoughtful touches, fresh flowers in the rooms, handwritten welcome notes. He scrolled through the dates, his heart beating faster as he approached that summer. Their summer. The last entry was dated exactly 1 week after the night they'd spent together in his private suite. No resignation letter, no exit interview, just nothing. But there was one more attachment, a medical form, automatically forwarded from the hotel's health insurance department. Luca clicked to enlarge it, squinting at the scanned document. The hospital's letterhead came into focus, followed by clinical terms that made his blood run cold. Diagnosis: Stage 3. Lymphoma. Recommended treatment: immediate chemotherapy. The words blurred as Luca pushed back from his desk, running a shaking hand through his hair. The quiet of his office suddenly felt suffocating. She'd been sick. While he'd been angry at her disappearance, hurt by what he'd thought was rejection, she'd been... Ilara, he whispered into the darkness, her name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. The guilt crashed over him in waves. He should have looked for her, should have noticed something was wrong. Instead, he'd retreated behind his walls, telling himself it was just another life lesson about keeping people at arm's length. But those girls, those beautiful, brave little girls selling wilted daisies in the rain, if they were 7 years old, if Ilara had been pregnant when she received that diagnosis. Luca's decision crystallized with the same sharp clarity he brought to business deals. He reached for his phone, scrolling to a number he rarely used. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Antonio, I need your services discreetly." Luca's voice was steady now, his professional mask back in place. "I'm looking for someone. Ilara Castelli, former employee of Hotel Fiorenza, but also search for any Ella Rossi with a similar description. Brown hair, brown eyes with gold flecks, probably in her early 30s now." He paused, then added, "She may have twin daughters around 7 years old." "Timeline?" Antonio asked, straight to business. "Start with Florence, focusing on the last 7 years, then expand the search throughout Tuscany. I want regular updates no matter how small the lead." "Understood, Mr. Varelli. I'll begin immediately." Luca ended the call and turned back to the computer screen. Ilara's photo seemed to watch him, those gentle eyes holding secrets he should have uncovered years ago. The guilt was still there, a heavy weight in his chest, but now it was joined by something else: determination. He would find her, find them, and this time he wouldn't let them disappear. 3 days passed in a blur of anticipation and carefully laid plans. Now Luca stood behind the tinted glass of his private observation room, overlooking the grand lobby of Hotel Fiorenza. His hands were clasped behind his back, knuckles white with tension as he watched the front doors. The morning light streamed through the hotel's stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the marble floor. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors swung open. A woman entered, and Luca's breath caught in his throat. She called herself Ella Rossi now, according to the employment agency's paperwork. Her hair was shorter, falling just past her shoulders in subtle waves, and there were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago. But her walk was exactly the same, that graceful, measured stride that had first caught his attention across this very lobby. Ilara paused near the reception desk, taking in the familiar surroundings. Her fingers brushed absently against the strap of her worn leather bag, a gesture Luca remembered from long ago. She wore simple black slacks and a forest green blouse. Professional but modest. The colors made her skin look pale, or maybe that was from the years of treatment she must have endured. The hotel's current head of housekeeping greeted her warmly, right on schedule. Luca watched as they exchanged pleasantries, noting how Ilara's smile remained careful, controlled. She'd always been good at maintaining professional boundaries. Too good, perhaps. He straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the glass. The past 3 days had given him time to master his reactions, to bury the storm of emotions beneath his usual polished exterior. He couldn't afford to let anything slip. Not yet. Precisely 12 minutes later, Luca sat behind his desk as his assistant showed Ilara into his office. The morning light caught the gold flecks in her eyes, those same eyes he'd seen in the twins' faces. "Ms. Rossi," he said smoothly, rising to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice." Her handshake was firm but brief. If she recognized him, she gave no sign. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Varelli." They sat, and Luca maintained his professional mask as he outlined the consulting position. "The Winter Botanical Gala is our premier event of the season. We're looking to create something truly exceptional this year, living art installations throughout the hotel with a focus on sustainable and local flora." He watched her face carefully as he spoke. There, a slight softening around her eyes when he mentioned local flowers. She'd always loved the wild blooms that grew in the Tuscan hills. "Your portfolio is impressive," he continued, gesturing to the file on his desk. "The work you've done with seasonal arrangements, particularly your integration of traditional Italian elements with modern design principles, is exactly what we're looking for." Ilara shifted slightly in her chair. "That's very kind, but I should mention that I can only commit to short-term projects at the moment." "Of course," Luca replied smoothly. "We're offering a 6-week contract with flexible hours. The compensation would be—" He named a figure that made her eyes widen slightly. It was well above market rate, but he needed to make sure she couldn't refuse. She hesitated, and he could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. The twins' school fees, winter clothes, a more stable apartment perhaps. "I would need to coordinate my schedule around my daughter's school hours," she said carefully. Luca kept his expression neutral, though his heart raced at the plural. "That won't be a problem. In fact, the staff lounge is available if they need a place to wait when you're here. Many of our employees have children who use it after school." Relief flickered across her face, quickly hidden. "In that case, I accept." They went through the paperwork, Luca hyper-aware of every small movement she made. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating. The slight furrow between her brows as she read the contract terms. 7 years had changed them both, but these little details remained the same. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Mira and Nella were supposed to be sitting quietly in the staff lounge. Instead, they had slipped away from the kind receptionist who was watching them, drawn by the familiar grandeur of the hotel's lobby. The security cameras tracked their progress as they explored, their worn shoes silent on the thick carpets. Mira led the way, bold as always, while Nella followed more cautiously, taking in every detail with her observant eyes. They peeked around marble columns and ducked behind potted plants, giggling softly at their own daring. The lobby looked different in daylight than it had that rainy morning when they'd first spotted Luca, but the elegant space still held the same magic. Mira pointed excitedly at the massive flower arrangements flanking the front desk, roses and lilies in crystal vases taller than she was. Nella's attention was caught by the intricate mosaic floor, tracing the patterns with her foot while her sister continued their exploration. Hours later, after the paperwork was signed and Ilara had left with the twins, Luca sat alone in his office. The security footage played on his computer screen, showing different angles of the girls' adventure through his hotel. He paused the video on a perfect frame, both girls looking up at something off camera, their faces lit with wonder. The resemblance to their mother was striking, but now that he knew to look, he could see himself there too. The shape of their eyes, the set of their jaws. The way Mira's eyebrows drew together just like his did when she was thinking hard about something. "They're mine," he whispered into the quiet office, the truth of it settling deep in his bones. The frozen image stared back at him. 2 little girls who had grown up without him, who had faced God knows what hardships, while he remained ignorant in his tower of privilege. His daughters. The word felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a language he should have known but had never learned to speak. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hotel's grand windows as Ilara walked through the lobby, her worn leather folder clutched tightly against her chest. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a simple navy dress that she'd mended twice but still looked professional enough, paired with her only decent blazer. Her practical flats clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way to the conference room. Inside, the gala planning team was already assembled. 5 impeccably dressed professionals sat around a gleaming mahogany table, their designer accessories and confident postures making Ilara acutely aware of her own modest appearance. But she lifted her chin and smiled. remembering how her daughters had helped her practice her introduction in their tiny kitchen last night. "Everyone, this is Ella Rossi, our floral design consultant," the event coordinator announced. "She'll be working with us to create the botanical installations for the winter gala." From his position at the head of the table, Luca maintained a careful distance, his expression professionally neutral. But his dark eyes missed nothing as Alara opened her folder and began presenting her initial concepts. "I was thinking we could incorporate local winter flora," she explained, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to the subject. "Tuscan cypress, winter jasmine, and hellebores, what locals call the Christmas rose. We could create living installations that tell the story of Florence's botanical heritage." As she spoke, her hands moved expressively, sketching shapes in the air. The team leaned forward, caught up in her quiet enthusiasm. Luca noticed how she seemed to forget her nervousness when discussing the flowers, just as she had years ago. The morning passed in a blur of planning sessions and budget discussions. During a brief coffee break, Alara's phone buzzed. Her face paled slightly as she read the message. "Is everything all right?" Luca asked, maintaining a carefully professional tone. "My daughters," she explained hesitantly. "Their after-school program was canceled today. They're actually nearby." "Have them come here," Luca suggested smoothly, as if the idea had just occurred to him. "The cafe has excellent hot chocolate. They can wait there until you're finished." Alara bit her lip, clearly torn between necessity and propriety. Before she could respond, the hotel's front desk called up. 2 young girls had just arrived asking for Ella Rossi. "Please," Luca insisted. "It's no trouble at all." Minutes later, Mira and Nella sat at a corner table in the hotel's elegant cafe, their worn backpacks tucked carefully under their chairs. Their eyes were wide as they took in the crystal chandeliers and fine china cups. A kindly waitress had already brought them steaming mugs of hot chocolate, topped with whipped cream and chocolate shavings. "This is the best hot chocolate ever," Mira declared, a whipped cream mustache decorating her upper lip. Nella nodded solemnly, carefully wiping her mouth with the crisp linen napkin. She ran her small hand over the polished table surface, then looked around the room with her characteristic, thoughtful expression. Luca approached their table, his steps measured and deliberate. "May I join you?" The girls exchanged a quick glance before nodding. He sat down across from them, noting how Nella's posture straightened to mirror his own. "Why does this place feel nice?" Nella asked suddenly, her quiet voice curious. Luca smiled, something warm unfurling in his chest. "Nice how?" "Like," she paused, searching for the right words. "Like when Mama makes soup when we're sick, or when we find a perfect flower. It feels safe." "That's exactly what we want people to feel here," Luca replied softly. "Like they found somewhere safe and warm." While they talked, Mira had been fidgeting in her seat, her eyes darting to the glimpse of greenery visible through a nearby door. Finally, she slipped away from the table, drawn by curiosity. The door led to Luca's private garden terrace, a hidden oasis in the heart of the hotel. Carefully tended flower beds lined the stone paths, and in one corner, a patch of familiar flowers caught her eye. Daisies, the same variety she and Nella had been selling that rainy morning. They weren't the fancy roses or exotic blooms that filled the rest of the garden. These were simple, sturdy flowers, their white petals reaching toward the sun. Later that evening, in their small apartment across the city, Alara tucked her daughters into their shared bed. The springs creaked as she sat on the edge of the mattress, smoothing their worn but clean blanket. "Mama?" Mira's voice was sleepy. "The man from the cafe." He felt kind. Alara's hands stilled on the blanket. Something about the way Mira said it, so certain, so familiar, made her heart skip a beat. She thought about the man she'd worked with all day, his controlled movements and careful distance, the way he'd looked at her daughters when he thought no one was watching. After the girls had fallen asleep, Alara lay in her own narrow bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The moonlight filtering through the thin curtains cast shadows that seemed to dance with her racing thoughts. "No," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely a breath. "It can't be him." But even as she denied it, memories surfaced. The same commanding presence, the same careful grace. The way he'd signed the contract with his left hand, just like... "No," she whispered again, turning onto her side. "It can't be him." The afternoon sun warmed the winter garden terrace as Luca made his way through the meandering stone paths. His polished shoes crunched softly on the gravel as he approached the daisy bed tucked away in the corner. These simple flowers held a special place among the more elaborate blooms that filled the hotel's prestigious gardens. He paused, noticing something different about the carefully tended patch. One daisy was missing, its absence like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Luca knelt down, his tailored suit pants brushing against the stone edging. There, pressed into the rich soil beside the empty spot, was a tiny footprint, clearly made by a child's shoe. A memory flashed through his mind. Mira's curious eyes as she'd wandered away from the cafe table yesterday. Her quiet exploration of this very garden. His lips curved into a slight smile as he traced the outline of the footprint with his finger, careful not to disturb it. The sound of approaching footsteps made him straighten up quickly. Ilara appeared around the corner, her arms full with a large tray of color swatches and fabric samples. Her brow was furrowed in concentration as she tried to balance everything while checking something on her phone. "Let me help you with that," Luca offered, his voice carefully casual as he stepped forward. Ilara startled slightly, nearly dropping her phone. "Oh, Mr. Varelli, I didn't see you there." She clutched the tray tighter, her knuckles whitening. "I was just heading to the conservatory to compare these against the natural light." "Actually," Luca said, gesturing to the garden around them, "why don't we walk through here? The winter garden might offer some unexpected inspiration for the gala's color scheme." His tone was professional, but his dark eyes watched her carefully. Ilara hesitated for a moment before nodding. That's a good idea. Thank you." They walked side by side along the winding path, maintaining a careful distance. The late afternoon light filtered through the cypress trees, casting dappled shadows on the stone walkway. Luca pointed out various flowers and plants, his knowledge of the garden clearly extensive. "Have you lived in Florence long?" he asked, his voice deliberately light as they paused to examine a cluster of winter jasmine. Ilara's fingers fidgeted with the corner of a color swatch. "No, not really. We moved around quite a bit before settling here." "We?" Luca prompted gently. "My daughters and I," she replied, then quickly added, "The jasmine would work beautifully for the entrance arrangements, don't you think?" Luca allowed her to redirect the conversation, noting how her shoulders had tensed at the mention of her children. They continued their walk, discussing flower varieties and design concepts, but he carefully wove personal questions between the professional ones. "Do your daughters like flowers?" he asked as they passed a bed of hellebores. "I noticed they seemed quite interested in the garden yesterday." Ilara's step faltered slightly. Yes, they do. We used to press flowers together when they were smaller." Her voice cracked almost imperceptibly on the word together, and she quickly cleared her throat. "Twin girls must keep you busy," Luca commented, watching her profile. The color drained from Ilara's face for a moment before she composed herself. "Yes, they're quite energetic," she managed, her voice slightly strained. "About the color palette for the main ballroom." She held up a swatch of deep burgundy, her hand trembling slightly. They completed their circuit of the garden, ending up back at the terrace exit. Ilara paused there, her gaze drawn to the patch of daisies in the corner. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, memory, perhaps regret, before she quickly looked away. "Thank you for the tour, Mr. Varelli," she said formally, but her voice was soft. "I should get back to work on these designs." Luca watched her hurry away, her back straight but her steps just a bit too quick to be casual. When she had disappeared around the corner, he turned back to look at the daisies, remembering how she used to arrange them in simple vases 7 years ago, when she worked as a maid in his hotel. "She remembers," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible above the gentle fountain nearby. Later that night, in her small apartment across the city, Alara sat on the edge of her bed after the girls had fallen asleep. The springs creaked softly as she reached under her mattress, pulling out an old envelope. Inside was a photograph she'd kept hidden for 7 years, a moment captured during a staff celebration at the hotel. In the photo, a younger Luca stood near the grand staircase, his usual formal expression softened by the hint of a smile. She'd been too scared to throw it away back then, even when she'd fled the hotel after her diagnosis. Now she ran her finger along the edge of the photograph, remembering that brief time before everything changed. The sound of Mira turning over in her sleep in the next room brought Alara back to the present. She quickly opened her bedside drawer and tucked the photograph inside, sliding it beneath some old papers. As she closed the drawer, her hand lingered on the handle for a moment before she pulled it away. The grand ballroom of Hotel Fiorenza glowed in the late afternoon light. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across the marble floors, their sparkle intensified by the test lighting being adjusted for the upcoming gala. The space hummed with quiet activity as staff members moved about, checking placements and measurements. Alara stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the ornate handle. Behind her, Mira and Nella fidgeted with barely contained excitement. She hadn't planned to bring them, but when the invitation came to preview her floral arrangements in situ, their pleading eyes had worn down her resistance. "Remember," she said softly, turning to face her daughters, "this is Mama's workplace. We need to be extra careful," Mira finished, bouncing on her toes. "We promise." Nella nodded solemnly, already wide-eyed at the grandeur before them. The usually quiet child reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it tight. Alara pushed open the heavy door and they stepped into the ballroom. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, roses, lilies, and delicate sprays of baby's breath arranged in towering centerpieces on each table. White cloth draped every surface, creating the illusion of fresh snow. Crystal vases caught the light, transforming simple arrangements into works of art. "Mama," Nella whispered, "did you make all of this?" Alara smiled, touching her daughter's shoulder. "With help from the team, yes." "What do you think?" "It's like a fairy tale," Mira declared, already moving toward the nearest table to examine the intricate arrangement. Above them, on the curved balcony that overlooked the ballroom floor, Luca stood perfectly still. His hands gripped the gilded railing as he watched the scene unfold below. The girls moved through the space with natural grace, their dark hair catching the light just as their mothers did. Mira's curious exploration and Nella's quiet wonder mirrored his own childhood memories of discovering the hotel's hidden treasures. He observed how Alara's eyes never left them, even as she spoke with the lighting director about adjustments. Her protective instinct was evident in every glance, every subtle movement toward them when they strayed too far. It stirred something in his chest, pride perhaps, or longing. Making his decision, Luca descended the curved staircase. His footsteps were quiet on the marble steps, but Mira's keen ears caught the sound. She turned, a ribbon from one of the centerpieces trailing from her fingers. "Oh," she said, quickly trying to tuck the ribbon back into place. "I was just looking." Luca knelt beside her, his usual formal demeanor softening. "Here," he said gently. "Let me show you how to create the perfect loop." His fingers moved deftly, demonstrating the technique. Mira watched intently, her small hands mimicking his movements. Nella drifted over to join them, drawn by the quiet interaction. She stood slightly behind her sister, but her eyes followed every motion of Luca's hands with fascination. "There," Luca said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "What do you think?" "It's better than before," Mira declared with characteristic boldness. Nella nodded in agreement, a shy smile playing at her lips. Across the room, Alara had frozen mid-conversation, her eyes fixed on the tableau before her. Luca kneeling between her daughters, their dark heads bent together over the centerpiece, their profiles startlingly similar in the afternoon light. Something shifted in her expression. Confusion first, then a warmth she couldn't quite suppress, followed by a flicker of fear that tightened the corners of her mouth. The lighting director continued speaking, but Alara heard nothing. She watched as Luca showed the girls how to adjust other ribbons, his movements patient and careful. The way he anticipated Nella's hesitation, the gentle encouragement he offered Mira, it spoke of something deeper than simple kindness to children. The afternoon light faded into evening, and staff members began filtering out of the ballroom. The girls had long since settled into drawing pictures at one of the tables, their paper carefully placed away from the centerpieces. Ilara moved through the room, making final adjustments to her arrangements, hyper-aware of Luca's presence as he reviewed setup notes with the event coordinator. Finally, they were alone in the vast space. The girls remained absorbed in their artwork, their whispered conversation echoing slightly in the quiet room. Ilara approached Luca, her steps measured but determined. "You're kind to them," she said softly, adjusting a daisy in a nearby arrangement. Her voice carried a gentle accusation. "Too kind for someone who just met us." Luca turned to face her, his expression composed but his eyes intense. The chandelier light caught the silver at his temples, and for a moment, Ilara remembered the younger man she'd known 7 years ago. "Some things just feel natural," he replied, his voice equally quiet. Ilara's hands moved to the daisies again, but they trembled slightly as she straightened stems that were already perfectly aligned. She didn't push further, but the question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken words and shared memories. The girls' laughter echoed across the ballroom, breaking the tension. Ilara's hand stilled on the flowers, and she drew a careful breath. The scent of daisies surrounded them, simple, honest flowers among the grandeur, just like the truth waiting to be acknowledged. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as parents and children said their goodbyes. Ilara kissed each of her daughters on the forehead, smoothing down their slightly wrinkled uniforms one last time. "Be good today," she reminded them, her usual morning ritual. "We will, Mama," the girls chorused. They watched their mother walk away, her figure growing smaller as she headed toward the bus stop that would take her to Hotel Fiorenza. Instead of joining their classmates who were already gathering by the school entrance, Mira and Nella lingered behind the old oak tree that marked the corner of the schoolyard. Their matching backpacks rustled as they huddled close together, heads nearly touching. "I'm sure of it now," Mira whispered, her eyes bright with conviction. "Did you see how he looked at us in the ballroom? Just like Mama does when she thinks we're not watching?" Nella twisted the end of her braid, a habit she'd developed when deep in thought. "But how can we be really sure?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if we're wrong?" Mira's face scrunched up in concentration. "We need a test," she declared. "Something only Mama would know about us." She paused, then her expression brightened. "I know. Remember when we were little, and Mama told us about the special flowers that only bloom at night?" Nella's eyes widened with understanding. "Moon lilies," she breathed. "She said they were magic because they shine in the dark, just like us." "Exactly," Mira bounced on her toes. "Nobody else knows they're our favorites, not even Aunt Rosa. We always pretend it's daisies because they're easier to find." Nella nodded slowly, her natural caution giving way to curiosity. "If he knows about moon lilies, then he has to be our papa," Mira finished. The school bell rang, startling them both. They hurried toward their classroom, the weight of their secret plan making them feel both nervous and excited. The afternoon sun had softened into a gentle golden light when Mira and Nella pushed open the heavy glass doors of Hotel Fiorenza. The lobby staff, now familiar with their presence, smiled and waved them through. The girls made their way to the cafe where they knew Luca would be waiting. He sat at what had become their usual table, a stack of papers set neatly aside. 3 cups of hot cocoa waited, topped with tiny mountains of whipped cream. Luca's own cup remained untouched. He never started until the girls arrived. "Good afternoon," he greeted them, standing as they approached. His formal manner always made Nella think of princes in fairy tales, though Mira had declared him more like a knight. "Hello," they replied in unison, sliding into their seats. Mira immediately reached for her cocoa, while Nella carefully arranged her napkin in her lap first. "How was school today?" Luca asked, his attention fully focused on them despite the busy cafe around them. "We learned about the solar system," Nella offered quietly. "And I drew a picture of the moon," Mira added, already reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a slightly crumpled paper, proudly displaying her artwork. Luca examined the drawing with genuine interest, noting the careful detail of the craters and the surprising accuracy of the phases shown in the corners. "This is excellent work," he said, his praise making Mira beam. They chatted about their day, the conversation flowing easier now than in their first meetings. Nella watched as Luca anticipated her sister's excited interruptions, how he seemed to understand her own preference for listening. It reminded her of how Mama always knew what they needed without asking. Mira caught Nella's eye, receiving a tiny nod. It was time. "Can I ask you something?" Mira said, setting down her nearly empty cup. A smudge of whipped cream dotted her nose. "Of course," Luca replied, automatically reaching for a napkin to wipe her nose, the gesture so paternal it made Nella's heart skip. Mira took a deep breath. "What flower would you give to someone you loved very, very much?" Luca's hand stilled for a moment. His eyes grew distant as if looking into the past. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Moon lilies." The girls froze. Mira's mouth dropped open in a perfect O of surprise, while Nella's hands clutched the edge of the table. The cafe's ambient noise seemed to fade away as they stared at him. "They're rare," Luca continued, unaware of the impact his words had made. "They only bloom at night, and their petals shine like starlight. They're not the most practical choice, but—" He trailed off as he noticed their expressions. "Is everything all right?" Mira launched herself from her chair, throwing her arms around him. Nella followed more slowly, but her hug was just as fierce when she reached him. Luca, startled but instinctively responsive, gathered them both close. The moment stretched warm and perfect until a sharp intake of breath broke the spell. Alara stood at the cafe entrance, her face draining of color as she took in the scene before her. Her hand gripped the doorframe, knuckles white with tension. Horror dawned in her eyes. Not fear of Luca, but fear of what the girls had discovered. She backed away without a word, disappearing into the hotel's bustling lobby. The girls, still wrapped in their revelation, didn't notice their mother's brief appearance. Later that night, in the quiet of her small apartment, Alara sat on the edge of her bed. The girls were asleep, their excited whispers finally fallen silent. She reached for the drawer of her bedside table, her movement slow and deliberate. The photograph she withdrew was worn at the edges, handled too many times over the years. It showed a younger Luca, his smile unguarded, his eyes bright with possibility. It had been taken during that brief, beautiful week when everything seemed possible, before the diagnosis, before the fear, before she'd run to protect both him and their unborn daughters. "You figured it out," she whispered to the image, her finger tracing the familiar lines of his face. The moonlight streaming through her window cast shadows across the photograph, highlighting the resemblance she saw every day in her daughter's features. The truth had finally emerged, brought to light by the innocent questions of children and the memory of flowers that bloomed in darkness. Thunder rumbled in the distance as rain pelted against the windows of Hotel Fiorenza. The winter storm had descended upon Florence suddenly, turning the elegant streets into rushing rivers of rainwater that reflected the golden glow of street lamps. Inside his office, Luca sat at his desk, the warm lamplight creating a cozy shelter against the darkness outside. He adjusted his reading glasses, studying the seating charts for the upcoming Winter Botanical Gala. Names and table numbers blurred together as his mind wandered to the scene in the cafe earlier that day. The feeling of his daughter's arms around him lingered, making it difficult to focus on the task at hand. The soft knock at his door startled him. At this hour, most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the night shift to tend to guests. He looked up to find Alara standing in the doorway, her clothes slightly damp from the rain. Her face was unreadable, but tension radiated from her rigid posture. "Come in," Luca said quietly, removing his glasses and setting them aside. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, trying to keep his movements calm and measured, despite the sudden racing of his heart. Alara closed the door behind her but remained standing for a moment, as if gathering her courage. When she finally sat, her back was straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Water dripped slowly from the ends of her hair onto her shoulders. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the office in stark white light. In that brief moment, Luca saw the same fierce determination in Ilara's eyes that he often noticed in Mira's. "Why did you hire me?" The question cut through the silence like a knife, direct and unwavering. Luca considered deflecting, offering some practical explanation about her qualifications or the hotel's needs. But looking at her face, seeing the years of worry and protection etched in the subtle lines around her eyes, he knew she deserved the truth. "I wanted to see if you were all right," he admitted, his voice soft but clear. "I found your records." The words hung in the air between them. Another crack of thunder punctuated the silence, closer now. Ilara's face transformed as understanding dawned, followed quickly by hurt and anger. She stood so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. "So you knew?" Her voice trembled. "All this time? You knew and said nothing?" The betrayal in her eyes cut deeper than any accusation she could have voiced. Luca rose slowly, his hands spread in a placating gesture. "Please let me explain. I didn't want to frighten you away. I wanted to earn your place." Ilara's laugh was bitter. "By deceiving me? By manipulating the situation?" "That wasn't my intention," Luca protested, moving around his desk. "I needed to understand what happened, why you disappeared. When I saw the girls that day selling flowers outside." "Stop!" Ilara held up her hand. "Just stop. You had no right to investigate me, to orchestrate this whole situation. Those girls are my life. Everything I've done has been to protect them." "They're my daughters too," Luca said quietly. Ilara flinched as if he'd struck her. "Daughters you never knew existed until a few weeks ago. Daughters I raised alone while fighting." She cut herself off, turning away. "While fighting cancer," Luca finished gently. "Ilara, if I had known—" "What?" She spun back to face him. "What would you have done? Watched me go through chemotherapy? Watched me lose my hair, my strength? Worried about whether the babies would survive? Is that what you wanted?" Rain lashed against the windows, matching the intensity of her words. Luca took a step toward her, but she backed away. "I made my choice," she said, her voice growing calmer but no less firm. "I chose to face it alone rather than burden anyone else. I chose to give my girls a chance at life without the weight of pity or obligation." "It wouldn't have been obligation," Luca insisted. "Not then and not now." Ilara shook her head, reaching for the door handle. "You don't understand. You can't just walk into their lives now and pretend the past 7 years didn't happen. They're not a business deal you can negotiate." Before Luca could respond, she pulled the door open and walked out. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, quick and determined. Luca followed, his longer strides carrying him through the empty hotel corridors and into the lobby. He stopped at the entrance, watching as Ilara stepped out into the storm. The doorman offered her an umbrella, but she ignored it, striding purposefully into the rain. Her figure grew less distinct as she merged with the crowd of pedestrians hurrying through the weather, a sea of black umbrellas obscuring her from view. Standing there, feeling the occasional spray of rain on his face, Luca reached into his pocket. His fingers found the now familiar piece of paper, the note that had started everything. The rain had gotten to it somehow, perhaps from his earlier walk in the garden. The ink was beginning to blur and run, but the childish handwriting was still legible. "Are you our daddy?" He held the paper more tightly, careful not to tear it despite its dampness. The simple question carried the weight of so many hopes, fears, and possibilities, not just his own, but those of 2 little girls who had been brave enough to ask what their mother had kept hidden for so long. The storm continued its assault on Florence well into the night, but inside Hotel Fiorenza, all was quiet except for the occasional rumble of thunder and the steady drumming of rain against windows. Luca stood in the doorway of a hidden suite on the top floor, his hand resting on the light switch. He hesitated before finally flicking it on, illuminating a room that told a story of hope and heartache. 2 small beds sat against opposite walls, their covers adorned with delicate butterfly patterns in soft purples and blues. Between them, a nightstand held a lamp with stars that would dance across the ceiling when lit. Everything was pristine, untouched, waiting for occupants who had never arrived. Luca moved slowly through the space, his fingers trailing along the spines of books arranged carefully on built-in shelves. Classic fairy tales in both Italian and English filled the rows. The Little Prince, Peter Pan, The Secret Garden. He had chosen each one imagining future bedtime stories, quiet moments of connection he'd never had the chance to share. A wooden toy chest sat at the foot of each bed, containing carefully selected items, art supplies, stuffed animals, building blocks. He knelt beside one and lifted the lid, the hinges silent from regular oiling despite never being used. Inside, a stuffed elephant looked up at him with glass eyes that caught the light. He had bought it the day after finding Alara's medical records, before he even knew for certain the twins were his. Moving to the window seat, Luca lowered himself onto the cushioned surface. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city lights beyond. He had designed this suite himself, converting what was once a storage space into a sanctuary. Every detail had been considered, from the constellations painted on the ceiling to the child-sized desk in the corner where he imagined the girls doing homework. The room was perfect, and perfectly empty. Luca leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as memories of the past few weeks played through his mind like a film reel. He saw Alara's first day at the hotel, the way she had tried so hard to seem confident despite her obvious nervousness. He remembered the subtle ways her hands shook when arranging flowers, how she always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. He should have told her immediately, should have been honest about finding her records, about recognizing the girls. Instead, he had tried to orchestrate everything perfectly, like one of his business deals. But Alara and the twins weren't a merger to be negotiated or a property to be acquired. They were family, his family, and he had approached them like a stranger trying to buy his way in. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room in stark white light. Luca pulled his phone from his pocket, finding Alara's number. He had memorized it from her personnel file, but had never used it. His thumb hovered over the screen before finally pressing dial. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. Her recorded voice was professional, distant. "You've reached Alara Rossi. Please leave a message." Luca waited for the beep, then spoke softly into the phone. "I'm not angry you left." He paused, his voice growing thicker with emotion. "I'm angry I wasn't there to fight with you." He ended the call and sat in silence, surrounded by all the possibilities this room represented, all the moments he had missed, all the struggles Alara had faced alone. The stuffed elephant still sat in the open toy chest, a silent witness to his regrets. Morning arrived with clearing skies, the storm having spent itself overnight. Luca stood in his office, watching through the window as the city came to life. Hotel staff moved efficiently through their morning routines, preparing for another day of perfect service. But his attention was fixed on the entrance, waiting. At precisely 9 o'clock, Alara arrived with the twins. She looked tired but determined, her spine straight as she guided the girls through the lobby. Mira and Nella were unusually subdued, holding tightly to their mother's hands as they walked. Luca knew what was coming. He had received Alara's resignation email at dawn, professional, formal, with no mention of their conversation or their shared past. She would complete her final day, supervising the installation of her floral designs for the gala, and then she would be gone. He didn't try to stop her, didn't attempt to change her mind or make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he focused on the girls, watching them from a distance as they explored the hotel one last time. They seemed to understand something was ending, their usual exuberance replaced by quiet observation. As the day drew to a close, Luca walked with them to the exit. The doorman held the door open, and Alara stepped through first, not looking back. But the twins lingered for a moment, their small faces turned up to his. Nella, who had always been the quieter of the two, reached for his hand. Her fingers were tiny against his palm as she pressed something into it, a piece of paper, folded carefully. She didn't speak, but her eyes met his with an intensity that reminded him so much of Alara. Then they were gone, following their mother down the steps and into the flow of pedestrians on the street. Luca stood watching until he couldn't distinguish them from the crowd anymore. Only then did he unfold the paper Nella had given him. It was a drawing of a moon lily, rendered in careful strokes of crayon. The petals were slightly uneven, the stem a bit wobbly, but it was unmistakably the flower he had mentioned that day in the cafe. The answer that had confirmed what the girls already suspected about who he was to them. Luca stood in the doorway of his hotel, holding a crayon drawing of a moon lily, watching the space where his family had disappeared into the city beyond. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, but his face remained composed, years of practiced control holding back the tide of emotions threatening to break free. The modest two-bedroom apartment sat on the 4th floor of an aging building in a quiet neighborhood, far from the glamorous heart of Florence. Inside, the afternoon sun filtered through thin curtains, casting gentle shadows across worn furniture and carefully tended potted plants. Mira and Nella sat at their small kitchen table, homework forgotten in front of them, their eyes following their mother as she moved around the apartment. "Mama," Mira began, her voice careful and measured in a way that made her sound older than her years. "Why aren't we going back to the hotel?" Alara paused in her task of sorting through bills at the counter, her hand stilled on the papers, and she took a deep breath before turning to face her daughters. The girls watched her with those piercing eyes, his eyes, and she felt her heart constrict. "We don't belong in places like that," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but she pushed through it. "That's a different world, sweetheart. Our home is here." Nella, who had been quietly drawing circles on her math worksheet, looked up. "But it felt like we did belong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything there felt right." Alara moved to the table and knelt between their chairs, placing a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. The girls didn't pull away, but they didn't lean into her touch as they usually did. They weren't angry. She could handle anger, had prepared herself for it. Instead, their faces showed a quiet sadness that cut deeper than any tantrum could. "I know it seemed nice," Alara said, "but sometimes nice things aren't meant for us. We have everything we need right here." Mira's lower lip trembled slightly. "But what about Mr. Varelli? He was nice too. And he knew about the moon lilies, Mama. He knew." Alara's chest tightened at the mention of Luca. She stood up quickly, moving back to the counter where she could hide her expression from the girls. "He was very kind," she managed to say, "but we need to focus on our own lives now. Why don't you finish your homework while I start dinner?" The twins exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations they'd been having since they were toddlers. Then they gathered their school things and headed to their shared bedroom, their footsteps unusually heavy on the creaking floorboards. Once in the kitchen, Alara began pulling ingredients from the cupboards with mechanical movements. She started chopping vegetables for pasta, the familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board usually soothing. But today each cut seemed to echo the words she'd spoken to the girls, words that felt increasingly hollow. While their mother worked in the kitchen, Mira and Nella slipped quietly from their room into hers. They moved with the stealth of children who had learned early how to be invisible when needed. Nella kept watch at the door while Mira went straight to the wooden dresser by the window. The second drawer from the top opened with a soft scrape. Beneath carefully folded scarves and winter gloves lay a small wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Mira lifted it out with reverent care, and both girls settled on the floor beside the bed. Inside the box were the few treasures their mother kept: their first baby shoes, tiny locks of hair from their first haircuts, and beneath it all, a photograph. The edges were slightly worn, but the image remained clear. Luca Varelli standing on the hotel's balcony, caught in a moment of unguarded laughter. The picture had been taken years ago before they were born, when their mother had worked at the hotel. His face was younger but unmistakable. Nella pulled the crayon drawing of the moon lily from her pocket, carefully smoothing out the creases. With delicate movements, she placed it beside the photograph in the box. The bright colors of the crayon stood in stark contrast to the faded photograph, but somehow they belonged together. "Do you think Mama will be mad?" Nella sussurrò mentre tornavano la scatola al suo nascondiglio. Mira shook her head. "Number, I think she's just scared." They slipped out of the room as quietly as they had entered, leaving behind their silent message in the drawer. Hours later, after the girls had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Alara returned to her room. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city and the soft whirring of the old ceiling fan. She changed into her nightclothes, going through her evening routine with practiced motions until something made her pause. The drawer wasn't quite closed. Her heart jumping, she pulled it open and lifted out the box. She knew immediately that someone had touched it. Mother's intuition, perhaps, or simply knowing her daughters too well. When she opened it, the bright colors of the crayon drawing caught her eye immediately. Alara sank onto her bed, the box in her lap. With trembling fingers, she lifted both items out, the photograph she had kept hidden for so long and the drawing her daughters had left as a bridge between past and present. Side by side, they told a story she had been trying to avoid. In the photograph, Luca's smile was genuine, unguarded, so different from the careful mask he usually wore. She remembered taking this picture during a rare moment when he had let his walls down, had allowed himself to simply be. The same smile she had seen him give the twins in the hotel cafe. The moon lily drawing was childish but filled with meaning. The girls had chosen to leave it here with this photograph, making a connection they shouldn't have had to make on their own. Tears began to blur Alara's vision as she looked at the two items in her hands. "I tried to protect you," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice thick with emotion. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of 7 years of decisions and sacrifices. She thought of the sadness in her daughter's eyes today, of the careful way they had accepted her explanations without believing them. Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph, remembering the fear and desperation that had driven her to leave without a word all those years ago. The diagnosis, the uncertainty, the overwhelming need to protect not just herself but the tiny lives growing inside her. She had convinced herself it was the only way. Looking down at the items in her hands, the past she had hidden and the present her daughters had tried to show her, Alara felt something shift inside her. "But maybe I was wrong," she whispered, the admission both frightening and freeing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the law office as Luca sat in a leather chair, his posture perfect despite his inner turmoil. Across the desk, Attorney Marco Bianchi reviewed the documents with careful attention, occasionally glancing up at his longtime client with poorly concealed curiosity. "These acknowledgement papers," Marco said, adjusting his reading glasses. "They're quite straightforward. But you're certain you don't want to file them yet?" Luca's fingers drummed once on the armrest before he caught himself. "Number, not yet. I just need them prepared." The lawyer nodded, understanding more than Luca had actually said. They had worked together long enough for Marco to recognize when his client needed discretion above all else. He began organizing the papers into a crisp manila folder. "The DNA test results you provided are conclusive," Marco continued. "The legal recognition of paternity would be virtually automatic once filed. The girls would have immediate rights to—" "I know," Luca cut in softly. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it that made Marco fall silent. "That's not why I'm doing this." Back in his office at the hotel, Luca sat at his desk, the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The legal papers were tucked away in his safe, but their presence seemed to fill the room. He pulled out a sheet of his personal stationery, cream-colored paper with a subtle watermark, and began to write. "Dear Alara," the pen hesitated over the paper, ink bleeding slightly where it touched. Then the words began to flow. "I understand now why you left. The hospital records told me everything you couldn't. What I can't understand is why you thought you had to face it alone. The thought of you in those sterile rooms, fighting for your life while carrying our children, and it haunts me. I would have been there. Every treatment, every scary moment, every victory. You didn't just protect the girls from potential pain. You protected me too. But I never needed that protection. I needed you." His handwriting, usually precise, became slightly uneven as he continued. "When I see them now, their smiles, their curiosity, their quiet strength that mirrors yours, I feel both blessed and broken. Blessed to know them at all, broken by the years I missed. They are extraordinary, Alara. You did that. You raised them to be remarkable despite everything. I'm not angry anymore, not at you. I'm angry at circumstance, at timing, at fate. But mostly, I'm angry at myself for being the kind of man you couldn't trust with your fear." Luca paused, running a hand over his face. The letter felt raw, too honest perhaps, but he couldn't stop. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want you to know that I understand. And I'm here now, if you'll let me be. Not just for the girls, but for you too. Always for you." He signed his name with a flourish that couldn't hide the slight tremor in his hand. After staring at the letter for a long moment, he carefully folded it and slipped it into an envelope. It joined a growing stack in his desk drawer, words he couldn't quite bring himself to send. Across the city, in her small apartment with its window boxes full of flowers, Ilara sat at her kitchen table. The girls were at school, and the silence seemed to press in around her. She pulled out a notebook, nothing fancy, just a simple spiral-bound thing with a blue cover, and began to write. "Luca." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. "7 years ago, I sat in a doctor's office and heard words that changed everything. Stage 3 lymphoma. Pregnancy test positive. Twins. The world tilted on its axis that day, and I made choices I'm not proud of, but choices I thought I had to make. I couldn't bear the thought of you watching me waste away, of you being tied to someone who might not survive to raise your children. The odds were against me, and I couldn't stand the idea of leaving you with that kind of pain. So I ran." Her pen moved faster now, tears occasionally dropping onto the paper. "Every time I looked at the girls as they grew, I saw you. In Mira's determination, in Nella's quiet grace. They were my miracle twice over. They gave me the strength to fight the cancer, and they carried pieces of you I thought I'd lost forever. Seeing you with them now, it's like watching a dream I never let myself have. You're so natural with them, so gentle. The way you remember little details about their lives, the way you listen when they speak. It breaks my heart in the best and worst ways. I denied them their father. I denied you your daughters. I denied myself the chance to see if what we had could have grown into something beautiful. All because I was terrified of leaving behind more pain than joy." Her handwriting became slightly messy as she poured out 7 years of bottled emotions. "The cancer is gone now. Has been for years. But the fear lingered. Fear that you'd hate me for what I did. Fear that the girls would resent me for keeping them from you. Fear that letting you in would somehow tempt fate to take it all away again. I watch you with them at the hotel, and it feels like being haunted by all the possibilities I was too scared to embrace. They love you already. I think maybe they always have. In that inexplicable way, children sometimes know things we don't." Ilara stopped writing, pressing her palms against her eyes for a moment. When she continued, her words were steadier. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know why. The girls deserve to have their father in their lives, and you deserve to know them properly. As for me, I'll understand whatever you decide." She signed her name and folded the paper carefully, sliding it into a plain white envelope. It joined several others in her bedside drawer, attempts at explanation that she couldn't quite bring herself to send. That evening, while Ilara was busy preparing dinner, Mira slipped into her mother's room. She knew exactly where to look. She'd seen her mother writing at night, had watched her tuck the letters away. Taking one of the envelopes, she pulled out her colored pencils and carefully drew the Hotel Fiorenza on the front. The grand entrance, the flowering vines, even the little cafe where they first saw Luca. Without a word to anyone, she put on her coat and told her mother she was going to check the mail. Instead, she walked to the post office around the corner, stood on tiptoe to reach the mail slot, and pushed the envelope through. It made a soft, swooshing sound as it fell in with the other letters, carrying words that had waited too long to be read. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of Hotel Fiorenza, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The usual bustle of guests and staff filled the lobby, their footsteps echoing off the ornate walls. At the front desk, Maria, one of the longest-serving receptionists, sorted through the morning mail with practiced efficiency. Her hands paused over a small, crumpled envelope. It stood out among the crisp business correspondence and elegant invitations that typically arrived at the hotel. The paper was slightly worn, as if it had been carried in someone's pocket before being mailed. There was no return address, just Mr. Luca Virelli, written in uneven letters on the front, along with a drawing of the hotel that could only have been done by a child's hand. Maria placed it carefully on top of the priority pile. When Luca arrived for his morning inspection of the lobby, she called out to him softly, "Mr. Virelli, this came for you in the Morning Post." Luca's eyes fixed on the envelope, recognition flickering across his features. He picked it up with careful fingers, as if handling something precious and fragile. Without a word, he nodded to Maria and headed toward the elevator, his usual morning routine forgotten. In his office, Luca closed the door quietly behind him. The envelope felt warm in his hands, or perhaps that was just his imagination. He sat at his desk, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the small piece of paper that held so much weight. With uncharacteristically unsteady hands, he opened the envelope carefully, trying not to tear it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, clearly torn from a children's drawing pad. As he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. The drawing was done in bright crayon colors, the kind that came in those big boxes with built-in sharpeners. 4 figures stood hand in hand in front of what was unmistakably the hotel's daisy garden. The tallest figure wore a dark suit. Himself, he realized with a start. Next to him was a woman with long dark hair and a gentle smile that he would know anywhere. Ilara. And between them, 2 small figures with matching pigtails and wide smiles, Mira and Nella. Above their heads floated a heart, colored in red and slightly lopsided, but drawn with obvious care. The sky was a brilliant blue, and flowers dotted the ground in cheerful yellow bursts. It was the kind of drawing that usually ended up proudly displayed on refrigerator doors in happy homes. Luca turned the paper over slowly, his fingers trembling slightly. There, in wobbly handwriting that spoke of great concentration and effort, were the words that made his heart constrict. "Please don't forget us." He stood up abruptly, the chair rolling back against the wall. The morning light seemed too bright suddenly, too harsh. He walked to the window, the drawing still in his hand, and looked out over Florence, the city that had witnessed so much of his life, of their story. The words echoed in his mind. "Please don't forget us." As if he could. As if every moment since discovering their existence hadn't been filled with thoughts of them. As if he didn't see their faces every time he closed his eyes. Moving with sudden purpose, Luca returned to his desk and opened his laptop. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he pulled up old files, searches he'd done weeks ago when he'd first started looking for Ilara. There it was, a conversation he'd overheard her having with one of the other staff members years ago, about a small cottage on the Amalfi Coast. "It's my secret happy place," she had said then, her eyes distant and dreamy. "A little yellow house with blue shutters right by the sea. Sometimes I imagine just running away there." He found the listing quickly. He'd bookmarked it weeks ago but hadn't been sure enough to act. The cottage was still there, still for rent. Yellow with blue shutters, just as she'd described. His fingers moved automatically, booking a flight for the next morning to Naples, then arranging for a car to take him along the coast. Her secret happy place, he murmured, looking again at the drawing with its bright colors and hopeful heart. He knew somehow that this was where she would have gone. Where else would someone go when they needed to think, to heal, to decide? The morning light caught the edges of the drawing, making the crayon marks shine. Luca carefully placed it in his inside jacket pocket, close to his heart. Then he began making calls, arranging for his absence from the hotel. Everything else could wait. This was what mattered now. The morning mist clung to the winding coastal road like a delicate veil, softening the edges of the dramatic cliffs that plunged into the Mediterranean below. Luca's rental car navigated the hairpin turns with precision, though his usual confident grip on the steering wheel betrayed a slight tremor. The early sun cast long shadows across the road, and the air carried the sweet scent of lemon groves that dotted the hillsides. He'd left Florence before dawn, driving through the quiet streets while the city still slept. Now, as he followed the coastal road south, his mind kept returning to Alara's words from years ago, words he'd filed away without knowing their importance. A tiny white house with blue shutters near a cliff with lemon trees. The GPS was useless here. This wasn't about finding an address. This was about following his instincts, about remembering the way Alara's eyes had lit up when she described this place. The morning fog parted occasionally, revealing glimpses of the sparkling sea below, and with each turn, Luca scanned the hillside for any sign of the house he sought. Small villages appeared and disappeared around each bend, their pastel buildings stacked like colorful blocks against the steep cliffs. The narrow roads forced him to slow down, which only increased his awareness of each passing moment. His jacket pocket still held the children's drawing, and he could feel it crackling softly with every movement, a constant reminder of why he was here. The road widened slightly as it entered a small seaside town. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor, and the morning market was just coming to life. Luca parked the car and stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the worn cobblestones. The air was different here, saltier, fresher, filled with the calls of seabirds and the distant sound of waves. Market vendors were setting up their stalls, arranging fresh produce and local goods with practiced care. Luca approached an elderly woman at a fruit stand, her weathered hands arranging lemons and oranges in neat pyramids. Her dark eyes studied him curiously as he approached. His tailored suit marked him clearly as an outsider in this small coastal town. "Buongiorno," he said softly, his voice carrying the refined accent of northern Italy. "I'm looking for a house, small, white with blue shutters, near the lemon groves on the cliffs." The woman's hands stilled over her fruit. She looked at him more closely now, her expression thoughtful. "Ah," she said finally, "the house where the quiet lady lives with her little ones?" She smiled knowingly. "The twins who help me carry my boxes sometimes?" Luca's heart quickened, but his face remained composed. "Yes," he said simply. The old woman pointed up the hill, past the church with its bell tower. "Follow the path past the old olive tree. You'll see the lemon grove first, then the house." She paused, then added gently, "The flowers in front, they're very beautiful. The little ones help their mama tend them." Luca thanked her with a slight bow and began the climb up the narrow stone steps that led away from the harbor. The path wound through the village, past morning quiet houses with laundry strung between buildings, until it opened up to a view that made him stop in his tracks. There it was, small and white against the green hillside, with shutters the color of the sea below. A neat garden spread out front, and even from this distance, he could see the carefully tended flower beds. Daisies, their distinctive white petals caught the morning light. 2 small bicycles leaned against the wall, and hanging by the door were 2 identical children's coats, swaying gently in the breeze. His feet carried him forward until he stood at the small gate. The house was quiet, but he could see warm light through the windows, could smell bread baking. This was where they had made their home, where Alara had created a safe haven for their daughters, his daughters. Luca reached into his pocket and pulled out the carefully folded moon lily drawing. He looked at it one last time, then walked to the rustic mailbox mounted by the gate. With gentle fingers, he slipped the paper inside, letting it rest there like a promise. The path down to the beach was well worn, showing the frequent passages of small feet. Luca followed it, his expensive shoes collecting sand as he made his way down to where the waves met the shore. He stood there, letting the sound of the sea wash over him, waiting. Inside the house, Alara moved through her morning routine, preparing breakfast for the girls. She glanced out the window, as she did countless times each day, looking out at the view that had become her comfort. But this time, something made her pause. A figure stood on the beach. Tall, straight-backed, unmistakable even at this distance. Her breath caught in her throat, Time seemed to stop as she stood there, one hand pressed against the cool window glass. How had he found them? But even as she asked herself the question, she knew the answer. She had told him about this place once in another life when they were different people. Before she could process what this meant, what to do, the twins ran past her in a blur of energy and excitement. They had seen him too, through their bedroom window perhaps, or maybe they had just felt it somehow. Their voices rang out clear and joyful as they burst through the front door. "Papa's here." The sound of their calls carried up from the beach, echoing off the cliffs, filling the morning air with a truth that could no longer be denied. The sea breeze whipped around Luca as he stood at the water's edge, his usually impeccable suit jacket draped over one arm. The wind tousled his dark hair, breaking through his carefully maintained appearance. He closed his eyes, breathing in the salty air so different from Florence's refined atmosphere. The sound of running feet on sand made his heart skip. "Papa!" Two voices called out in unison, and before he could turn fully, small bodies crashed into him with the force of their excitement. His jacket fell forgotten to the sand as he dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around Mira and Nella. They smelled of fresh bread and sunshine, their wild curls tickling his face as they pressed close. Nella pulled back slightly, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. Her eyes, his eyes, studied him with that quiet intensity that always caught him off guard. "You found us," she said softly. "Like in the story." Her words carried the weight of fairy tales and happy endings, of lost things being found. Mira bounced on her toes, unable to contain her energy. "We knew you would. We knew it." She grabbed his hand, her fingers warm and sticky with what might have been jam from breakfast. Up on the path that wound down from the house, Alara stood frozen. The morning light caught her hair, turning it to copper and gold, but her face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Her hands opened and closed at her sides as she watched her carefully constructed world shift on its axis. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. Part of her wanted to turn around, to retreat to the safety of the house. Another part couldn't look away from the sight of Luca with their daughters. The girls' laughter carried up the beach as they showed Luca their favorite shells and stones, precious treasures collected over countless mornings. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions, and smiling in a way Alara had never seen before. Open, unguarded, nothing like the controlled hotel owner she'd known. Finally, she made her way down the slope, each step measured and careful. The sand shifted under her feet, making her feel unsteady. Or maybe that was just the situation itself that made her feel off balance. Luca looked up as she approached, and something passed between them. Recognition, regret, possibility. The girls sensed the change in atmosphere and drifted a little way down the beach, still within sight but giving their parents space without being asked. "You shouldn't have come," Alara said, but her voice lacked real conviction. "You had no right to just show up here." "I know." Luca's voice was quiet, carried on the wind. "But they had a right to be found." Alara wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture. "Is that what this is? Another calculated move? Like hiring me at the hotel? Like pretending you didn't know who I was?" The words came out sharp, edged with 7 years of protective anger. "I made mistakes," Luca admitted, watching the girls chase seabirds down the beach. "I thought I could control the situation, make it perfect before revealing the truth. I was wrong." He turned to face her fully. "But this time I came only to ask." "Ask what?" Alara's voice wavered slightly. "For a chance." Luca's eyes met hers, and she saw something there she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. "I don't want to fix what's broken. I want to build what never got a chance." The words hung between them, carried on the salt air. Down the beach, Mira's laugh rang out as Nella showed her something in the sand. The sound seemed to crack something in Alara's carefully maintained walls. She looked at Luca, really looked at him. His usually perfect hair was windblown, his expensive shirt wrinkled from the girl's embrace. There was sand on his knees from kneeling to hug them. He looked nothing like the polished hotel owner who had interviewed her weeks ago. He looked like a father who had found his children. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. She didn't smile, but her voice was softer when she spoke. Would you like to stay for dinner?" It wasn't a yes to his larger question, but it wasn't a no either. It was a crack in a door that had been closed for 7 years. That evening, rain tapped gently against the windows of the small kitchen, creating a cozy backdrop to their meal. The table was barely big enough for 4, and their elbows bumped occasionally as they passed dishes back and forth. The girls had insisted on helping cook, resulting in slightly misshapen pasta that tasted perfect. Mira chatted excitedly about everything and nothing, while Nella watched them all with her quiet, knowing eyes. Luca sat somewhat awkwardly in the tiny space, his long legs careful not to knock against the table legs, but his discomfort was overshadowed by the wonder in his expression as he watched his daughters eat the food they had helped prepare. Ilara moved around them with practiced ease, refilling water glasses and passing bread. Sometimes her hand would brush Luca's shoulder as she reached past him, and each time, both of them would freeze for just a moment before continuing as if nothing had happened. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the window panes, and the small kitchen glowed warm and golden in the light of the old lamp hanging overhead. Steam rose from their bowls, carrying the scent of herbs and home-cooked comfort. Outside, the world was gray and wet, but inside this tiny kitchen, something new and fragile was taking root, nourished by pasta sauce and children's laughter and the soft sound of rain. Morning sunlight streamed through the cottage's windows, casting warm patches on the worn wooden floor where Mira and Nella lay on their stomachs. Their legs kicked lazily in the air as they worked on their latest masterpiece, markers squeaking against paper. The sound of waves breaking against the cliffs drifted in through the open window, mixing with their quiet humming. Mira's tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, carefully drawing 2 interlocking circles in gold marker. Around them she added daisies, their petals slightly uneven but drawn with obvious care. Each flower had exactly 5 petals, just like the ones in the hotel garden. "They need more sparkles," Nella decided, reaching for the silver marker. She added little dots around the rings that caught the light when the paper moved. "Wedding rings should shine. Like Mama's eyes when Papa looks at her," Mira agreed, nodding seriously. She picked up the blue marker next, adding tiny hearts between the daisies. "Do you think they know we can see them looking at each other all the time?" Nella giggled, rolling onto her side. "Grown-ups think they're so sneaky." She reached for another piece of paper, this one showing what looked like 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. "Should we draw the wedding here by the sea?" "Yes." Mira's eyes lit up. "And we can put flowers everywhere. Papa can get them from his garden." She paused, considering. "Do you think Mama will wear white? Or maybe blue like the ocean?" "Blue," Nella decided firmly. "Like the shutters on our house." She began sketching a long dress on one of the stick figures, her small face scrunched in concentration. The floorboards creaked softly, and both girls looked up to see Ilara standing in the doorway. She wore one of her old sweaters, too big but comfortable, her copper hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes fixed on the drawing of the rings, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, then a soft kind of wonder. A laugh escaped her, gentle and slightly watery. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, but not before the girls saw her eyes growing bright with tears. They weren't sad tears, though. They recognized the way the corners of her eyes crinkled, the same way they did when she was truly happy. Movement in the corner drew Ilara's attention. Luca stood there, leaning against the wall in a casual way that still seemed elegant somehow. He'd been so quiet, she hadn't noticed him watching. Their eyes met across the room, and something electric passed between them, understanding, memory, possibility. The girls exchanged knowing looks as their parents continued their silent conversation. Mira made an exaggerated yawning sound, stretching her arms wide. "I'm sleepy, Nella. Let's go take a nap." Nella caught on immediately, fighting back a grin. "Me too. So sleepy." She gathered up their drawings, carefully setting them on the coffee table where they couldn't be missed. As the twins headed to their room, their whispered giggles trailing behind them, Ilara shook her head fondly. They're about as subtle as a sunset, she murmured. They come by it honestly, Luca replied, his voice warm with amusement. He gestured toward the back door. Walk with me? The garden's lovely this time of day. Alara hesitated only a moment before nodding. They stepped out into the small garden, where wildflowers grew in cheerful disorder among the vegetables. It was nothing like the manicured precision of the hotel gardens, but somehow more beautiful for its wildness. They walked in comfortable silence for a few steps, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, and bees hummed lazily among the flowers. Finally, Alara spoke, her voice soft but clear. I used to imagine this, you know. She ran her fingers along a fence post, not meeting his eyes. This life, this garden, you with the girls. She laughed, but it caught in her throat. I would hate myself afterward for wanting it so much, for dreaming about something I thought I could never have. Luca stopped walking, turning to face her. The morning light caught in her hair, making it glow like burnished copper. Why couldn't you have it? Because I was dying, she said simply. Or I thought I was. And you had your perfect life, your perfect hotel. I couldn't bear to watch you try to fix me, to see pity in your eyes. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. And then, when I got better, it had been so long. The girls were everything to me. I couldn't risk their hearts on maybes. And now? Luca's voice was gentle, barely above a whisper. Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. Now I watch you with them and I see no pity, no fixing, just love. Her voice trembled slightly. It terrifies me how much I want this. Something shifted in Luca's expression. He glanced toward the house, then back at her. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee in the garden path. Alara's breath caught. From his pocket he pulled not a velvet box, but something much more precious, a single daisy, its stem carefully wrapped with a red ribbon that she recognized from Mira's art supplies. He held it up, his hands steady but his eyes full of emotion. No diamonds, he said softly. No grand gestures, just me, the man who should have never let you go. His voice grew thick. The man who wants to spend every morning watching our daughters draw their dreams on the floor, who wants to learn the names of all your wildflowers, who wants to build something real with you, if you'll let me. Tears spilled down Alara's cheeks as she looked at the simple daisy, at this powerful man kneeling in her humble garden. A laugh bubbled up through her tears, bright and free. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, she finally managed, her voice breaking on the word. Yes. Luca stood, closing the distance between them. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb gently brushing away her tears. Alara leaned forward, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of salt and joy and 7 years of waiting. From the house came the sound of poorly suppressed squealing. They broke apart, looking up to see two small faces pressed against the window, identical grins splitting their features. Mira gave them an enthusiastic thumbs up while Nella bounced up and down, their pretense of napping completely forgotten. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Luca's sleek black car pulled up to Hotel Fiorenza's grand entrance. This time, everything felt different. The same marble steps that had once felt like mountains to climb now seemed to welcome them home. Alara stepped out first, wearing a simple blue dress that made her copper hair shine like autumn leaves. Her hand trembled slightly as she helped Mira and Nella from the car, their matching white dresses swishing around their knees. They carried their favorite books clutched to their chests, worn copies of fairy tales their mother had read to them countless times. It looks bigger from the front, Nella whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the hotel's imposing facade. Mira nodded in agreement, squeezing her sister's hand. Luca emerged last, carrying their overnight bags with casual grace. He'd insisted they stay at the hotel for a few days, while the cottage was being prepared for their permanent return to Florence. The girls had been thrilled at the prospect of a fancy holiday, as they called it. As they approached the entrance, the doorman, Giorgio, who had worked there for 20 years, broke into a warm smile. He remembered Alara from before, though he was too discreet to mention it. Instead, He gave a formal bow to the twins, who giggled and attempted to curtsy in return. The lobby gleamed with its usual perfection, marble floors reflecting the crystal chandeliers above. At the reception desk, Maria's eyes widened in recognition as she saw Ilara approach. The last time she'd seen her former colleague, Ilara had been in a hotel uniform, not walking in as a guest with the owner's hand resting gently on her lower back. "Welcome to Hotel Fiorenza," Maria exclaimed, genuine joy lighting up her face. She rushed around the desk to embrace Ilara, protocol forgotten. "Oh, it's wonderful to see you again. And these must be your daughters." She knelt down to the twins' level. "You look just like your mama when she used to work here, except twice as lovely, because there are two of you." Mira beamed at the compliment while Nella shyly hid her face in her mother's skirt. Ilara felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the warm welcome. She had expected awkwardness or judgment, not this outpouring of affection. "Thank you, Maria," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "It's good to be back." Luca watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, noting how the staff's genuine warmth helped ease the tension from Ilara's shoulders. This was exactly what he'd hoped for, that she would see she belonged here not as an employee, but as family. "Shall we go up?" he asked softly after the greetings were complete. "I have something to show you all." They took the private elevator to the top floor, the twins pressing their faces against the glass walls to watch Florence spread out below them. When the doors opened to the rooftop terrace, all three of them gasped. The space had been completely transformed. Where there had once been a simple garden, now stood an enchanted wonderland. Wooden pergolas draped with flowing white fabric created intimate spaces throughout the terrace. Comfortable chairs and small tables were arranged in cozy groupings, each with its own reading lamp. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes both old and new. But the most striking feature was the flowers. Daisies bloomed everywhere, in raised beds, in hanging baskets, in delicate vases on every table. They weren't the wilted flowers of street vendors, but strong, healthy blooms in various sizes and colors. Some were classic white with yellow centers, others pink-tipped or pure cream. They seemed to dance in the light breeze, their faces turned toward the sun. "Papa," Mira exclaimed, spinning in a circle to take it all in. "Did you do this?" Luca guided them toward a copper sign mounted on the wall. In elegant script it read, "Daisies in December, curated by Ilara and the Varelli girls." Ilara's hand flew to her mouth. "Luca," she breathed. "This is yours," he finished simply. "All of yours. A place to read, to dream, to grow things. A place where guests can find the same peace you always found in gardens." Nella had already discovered the children's corner, where child-sized armchairs surrounded a low table, perfect for drawing or reading. Colorful cushions were scattered across a soft rug, and the nearby shelves held picture books at just the right height for small hands. "Look, Mira," she called, "they have our favorite story." The girls settled into the reading nook as naturally as if they'd been doing it their whole lives. They pulled out their own books, adding them to the shelf with careful reverence, before selecting new ones to explore. As evening approached, the terrace took on a magical quality. Strings of fairy lights twinkled to life automatically, creating a soft golden glow that complemented the deepening blue of the sky. The air grew cooler, and Luca wrapped a soft blanket around Ilara's shoulders as they sat together on a cushioned bench. The twins had created their own little world in the reading nook, taking turns reading stories to each other in quiet voices. The sound of their gentle laughter mixed with the distant hum of the city below. Ilara leaned her head against Luca's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the sweet fragrance of daisies. His arm tightened around her, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding what we needed. Not luxury or grandness, just this. Something that feels like us." Before Luca could respond, a collective gasp from the twins drew their attention. Tiny white flakes were beginning to drift down from the darkening sky, the first snow of the season, arriving unusually early. "Snow!" Mira exclaimed. abandoning her book to rush to the terrace edge. Nella followed, both girls watching in wonder as the flakes swirled and danced in the fairy lights. The wind picked up slightly, causing the daisy petals to flutter and sway, creating a beautiful dance between the falling snow and the resilient flowers. It was a perfect moment, the kind that usually only exists in dreams or memories, yet here it was, real and precious and theirs. The morning sun cast long shadows across Hotel Fiorenza's rooftop terrace as Luca made his usual rounds. The crisp December air carried the sweet scent of fresh pastries from the kitchen below, mixing with the ever-present fragrance of daisies that had become the hotel's signature. He paused at the entrance to the new cafe, his attention caught by movement near the wall. Ilara stood on a small stepladder, her copper hair tied back in a loose braid, carefully hanging a wooden sign. Her hands moved with the same gentle precision she used when arranging flowers, making sure each letter was perfectly aligned. The sign read, Ilara Virelli, Floral Curator, in elegant hand-painted script, the letters gleaming with fresh gold paint. She sensed his presence and turned a mischievous glint in her eyes. "What do you think?" she asked, stepping down from the ladder. A small smudge of gold paint decorated her cheek, matching the warmth in her smile. "Perfect," Luca replied, moving closer to inspect the sign. "Though I think you missed a spot." Before he could react, Ilara reached out and playfully brushed her paint-stained fingers across the sleeve of his impeccable black coat. "There," she said with a laugh. "Now it's perfect." Instead of his usual concern for pristine appearance, Luca found himself chuckling. The gold handprint on his sleeve felt like a badge of honor, proof of how much his life had changed. Their relationship had settled into something real and comfortable, like a favorite book finding its proper place on a shelf. Downstairs in the lobby, Mira and Nella had taken up their self-appointed positions as the hotel's unofficial welcome committee. They wore matching blue dresses with daisy-embroidered collars, their dark hair neatly braided like their mother's. A silver cart beside them held a tray of delicate pastries, each shaped like a perfect daisy with crystallized sugar petals. "Would you like one?" Nella offered shyly to an elderly couple checking in. "They're special today. Mama helped design them." The woman accepted a pastry with a warm smile, studying the girls' faces. "You two are absolutely lovely," she said, glancing between them and Luca, who stood watching from near the front desk. "Are you Mr. Virelli's daughters?" Mira's face lit up with pride. "Yes," she declared, straightening her shoulders. "But we found him ourselves." She shared a knowing look with her sister. "It was like a treasure hunt, wasn't it, Nella?" Luca couldn't contain his laughter at hearing the description. The sound echoed through the lobby, drawing smiles from nearby guests and staff. It was true. They had found him, in their own determined way. Later that afternoon, Ilara entered the garden office to file some paperwork. The small room overlooked the rooftop garden, sunlight streaming through windows framed by climbing vines. On her desk sat a cream-colored envelope she didn't recognize. Inside, she found legal documents carefully prepared and officially stamped. Her eyes scanned the text, understanding dawning slowly. They were papers acknowledging Luca as the twins' father. But what caught her attention was what wasn't there. Her own name and role remained unchanged, fully intact. Luca hadn't tried to diminish or replace her position in their daughters' lives. He had simply added his presence alongside hers, completing their family circle rather than redrawing it. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. This was Luca's way. Quiet actions that spoke volumes, careful consideration that showed his deep understanding of what they all needed. As evening settled over Florence, Ilara returned to their suite after tucking the girls into bed. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of bedside lamps. On her pillow sat a small velvet box, midnight blue against the white cotton. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside nestled a ring unlike any she'd seen in the hotel's luxury shops. The band was simple silver, but along its surface was engraved a single, perfect daisy, its petals catching the light as she turned it. Beneath the ring lay a folded page, clearly torn from a book with careful precision. The page header read, "The family we pick twice," in elegant type. Before she could read further, She sensed movement and turned toward the doorway. Luca stood there, leaning against the frame with casual grace. His usual formal attire was gone, replaced by a simple white shirt with rolled sleeves. He looked softer this way, more like the man who read bedtime stories to the twins than the hotel magnate who commanded board meetings. "You still saying yes?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying that hint of vulnerability that only she ever heard. Alara looked down at the ring, then back at him. The man who had waited, who had understood, who had chosen to build rather than demand. The father who had let their daughters find him in their own time. The partner who knew that love wasn't about possession, but about growing together. She nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Luca crossed the room in 3 long strides. When their lips met, it wasn't the desperate kiss of their past, or the tentative kisses of their reunion. This kiss was slow, sure, and permanent, like the daisy engraved on the ring, like the roots they'd all put down together in this place that had become their home. The December sun cast long shadows across Hotel Fiorenza's rooftop terrace, painting the scene in warm winter light. One year had transformed the space into something magical, a hidden garden perched above Florence's ancient streets. The cafe, Daisies in December, had become a sanctuary for both travelers and locals alike. Flowering vines cascaded down trellises, their delicate blooms defying the winter chill. Small tables dotted the space, each adorned with fresh flowers in crystal vases. Guests lounged in comfortable chairs, steam rising from porcelain teacups as they chatted softly, or lost themselves in books from the carefully curated shelves. A wooden bookcase stretched along one wall, topped with a hand-painted sign that read, "Mira and Nella's Picks." The shelves held an eclectic collection, fairy tales in multiple languages, illustrated guides to flowers, and leather-bound classics that the twins had discovered in Luca's library. Each book bore a small paper bookmark with handwritten notes from the girls, sharing why they loved the story. An elderly woman sat with her granddaughter, both giggling over a book about a princess who grew flowers in unlikely places. At another table, a young couple shared a plate of daisy-shaped cookies while flipping through a photo album of the cafe's transformation. The space hummed with quiet contentment, exactly as Alara had envisioned it. Near the service counter, Luca stood reviewing a delivery form, his reading glasses perched on his nose. His usual formal suit had been replaced by a casual charcoal sweater, a change that still surprised some of his business associates but delighted his family. A delivery man waited patiently, holding a cart filled with elegant white blooms. "The moon lilies are perfect," Luca said, signing the form with a flourish. "Make sure they're added to our standing weekly order." Alara appeared from the greenhouse section, her arms full of greenery. She wore a simple cream dress with a blue apron, her copper hair twisted into a practical braid. Her eyes lit up at the sight of the flowers. "They arrived just in time," she said, setting down her burden to inspect the delicate petals. Together they carried the flowers to a central table, where Alara began crafting a stunning centerpiece. Her hands moved with practiced grace, weaving the moon lilies among silver branches and winter berries. A small group of guests gathered to watch her work, drawn by the elegant display taking shape. "Those flowers are extraordinary," a woman remarked, her accent marking her as an American tourist. "I've never seen anything quite like them." Alara smiled, adjusting a bloom with gentle fingers. "Moon lilies are special to our family," she explained. "They're actually how our daughters helped their father find his way back to us." The tourist leaned forward, intrigued. "Is that why the cafe is called Daisies in December? It seems an unusual name for such an elegant place." Before Alara could answer, Mira appeared with a stack of fresh menus, her dark hair in 2 neat braids. "Mama, we updated the tea list like you asked," she announced proudly. Nella followed close behind, carefully carrying a tray of sample cookies to display. The girls had grown into their roles as the cafe's junior hosts with natural grace. Mira handled the creative aspects, designing menu cards and suggesting new flower arrangements, while Nella excelled at organization, keeping track of inventory and guest preferences with remarkable attention to detail. Alara gathered her daughters close, one hand on each of their shoulders. "We called it Daisies in December because some things bloom even in the coldest seasons," she explained to the tourist. Love, family, hope, they can flourish at any time if you nurture them properly. The woman nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes as she watched the family's easy interaction. Around them, the cafe continued its gentle rhythm. The clink of cups, the rustle of pages turning, the soft murmur of conversations in various languages. As evening approached, the first snowflakes began to fall over Florence. The cafe's warm lights created a cozy glow against the darkening sky, and strings of tiny bulbs twinkled among the vines. Most guests had departed, leaving the family alone in their rooftop haven. They sat together at their favorite window table, watching the snow dust the city's ancient domes and spires. Luca had loosened his collar, relaxed in a way he never would have been a year ago. Ilara leaned against his shoulder, their hands intertwined on the table. Mira climbed into Luca's lap, her small face thoughtful as she watched the snowfall. The question came softly, carried on a child's wondering voice. What if you never saw us that day? Nella looked up from her spot beside Ilara, equally curious about the answer. The girls often asked about the story of their reunion, each telling revealing new details they hadn't noticed before. Luca wrapped his arms around Mira, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. His voice was sure and steady when he answered, "Then I never would have become who I was meant to be." The snow continued to fall, creating a peaceful curtain around their sanctuary. From the street below, the rooftop garden glowed like a beacon in the winter night. The vintage-style sign, "Daisies in December," flickered softly in the snowfall, its golden letters a promise kept. Everything that had once been scattered and broken had found its proper place. The lonely hotel owner, the protective mother, the searching children, all had bloomed into something beautiful, like flowers defying winter's chill. Their story had come full circle right here where it began, proving that sometimes the most precious things grow in the most unexpected seasons. If you enjoyed the story of Luca and Ilara, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.